They called me into the office on a gray Friday afternoon, just 3 days after I'd completed my final round of radiation. My hair hadn't grown back, my hands still trembled every morning as I gripped my coffee cup, and my voice hoarse from too many sleepless nights still hadn't returned to normal. But I showed up to work anyway, not because I was fully healed, but because I refused to be seen as weak or worse, replaceable. I wasn't expecting applause or even a thank you, but I certainly didn't expect to be pushed out the door like this. My name is Caroline Hayes. I'm 60 years old, and until that afternoon, I had devoted nearly 3 decades of my life to Wilburn Dynamics, a manufacturing firm just outside Columbus, Ohio, a place I once considered my second home. As head of internal compliance, I spent my days combing through contracts, verifying figures, and being the quiet voice in the room when something didn't sit right. I live alone now. My husband passed away from a stroke years ago, and though the job was far from glamorous, it gave me a sense of purpose, of stability, of control. So when I sat across from Travis Denton, the new director brought in to streamline operations, I already knew something was wrong. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers tapping slowly against the desk, and offered a smile that chilled me more than the October wind outside calculated. Distant, hollow. 29 years, 11 months, and 28 days, I said before he could speak, because I knew exactly how long I'd been there. 3 more days and my pension would fully vest. I didn't say the rest out loud, but we both knew what that meant. A lifetime of retirement benefits, full healthcare coverage, and a well-earned end to a long, loyal career. But Travis didn't flinch. He slid a sealed envelope toward me and said, almost as if he were reading the lunch menu, "Wilburn Dynamics regrets to inform you that your position is being eliminated, effective immediately, due to budgetary restructuring." I looked at the envelope, then back at him, and I knew this wasn't about budgets. This was a hit, timed, precise, delivered when they thought I was too fragile to fight back, too tired, too grateful just to be alive, too broken from the cancer to make a scene. But I didn't cry. I didn't beg. What rose inside me wasn't rage or fear, it was a sharp, icy clarity, the kind that only comes when you realize you've been betrayed in the most calculated way. This wasn't just a layoff. This was a cover-up. And I suddenly knew I wasn't walking out of that building quietly. As I left Travis's office with the envelope pressed against my chest like a burial notice, the weight of what had just happened didn't fully settle until I reached my floor and saw Janet from HR standing nervously near my desk. Her face was pale, her eyes darting between me and the 2 uniformed security officers who lingered nearby like vultures waiting for a signal. She didn't speak at first, just handed me a cardboard box with a pair of disposable gloves tucked inside, as if I were being asked to remove a contamination rather than the final pieces of a 30-year career. "I'm so sorry, Caroline," she whispered, her voice cracking like the shell of someone who knew this wasn't right, but lacked the courage to say it aloud. I gave her a small, tight smile, not because I felt any warmth in that moment, but because I refused to let them see me broken. I placed my daughter's college photo gently into the box, along with a dusty potted fern she gave me the day she left for California, promising to visit as soon as things settled. I packed the framed commendation from my 25th year of service, the one the previous CEO had handed me with pride and sincerity before he was quietly edged out in favor of cost-cutting. I left behind the generic office supplies, the pens that always ran out of ink, and the company mug with a cracked handle. What mattered could fit in a single box. What mattered more couldn't fit in any box at all. As I walked down the hallway one last time, flanked by security like a criminal, no one met my eyes. The team I had mentored, fought for, and covered countless mistakes, for each of them kept their heads down, pretending to work, pretending not to see. It wasn't cowardice so much as survival. I didn't blame them. Fear makes ghosts of good people. The rain had started while I was upstairs, that soft kind of April drizzle that clings to your coat and soaks your skin without you even noticing. I drove through the slick, familiar streets of Columbus in silence, passing the hospital where I had received my first diagnosis, the church where I buried my husband, and the quiet park where I once walked every Sunday, when the world still felt like it had rules. At a red light, I looked at myself in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back hollow eyes, graying skin, but something sharper now, something alive behind the exhaustion. Not anger, not yet, just a quiet understanding, This wasn't incompetence or oversight. This was surgical. This was designed. When I reached home, the kettle hissed while I changed out of my damp clothes and laid the severance envelope on the kitchen table like an unexploded mine. The document inside offered 3 months pay on, the condition that I waived all rights to future legal claims, surrendered any discussion of pension or health benefits, and agreed to silence. It was written in the cold language of contracts, but the message was unmistakably human. Vanish quietly, and we'll pay you to forget everything you saw. But I hadn't forgotten. In the months leading up to my diagnosis, I had begun noticing strange discrepancies, purchase orders that didn't match deliveries, vendor invoices with altered dates, safety certifications logged before tests were conducted. At first, I thought it was just sloppy bookkeeping, the kind of oversight that happens when new leadership is in a rush to move fast and break things. But the patterns were too consistent, too convenient. I reported them dutifully, sending flagged documents to upper management. Most were ignored. A few were returned with comments like, "Let's not overcomplicate things," or "Focus on what's actionable." I kept copies anyway out of habit, out of caution, out of something deeper I didn't yet have a name for. After the diagnosis, when my world had shrunk to doctor's appointments and treatment schedules, I assumed they'd finally leave me alone. Instead, the pace of questionable activity accelerated, and the responses to my reports stopped altogether. That's when I started printing things out, quietly, night after night. I brought them home in my handbag, slid them behind photo albums, and stored them in a fireproof lockbox in the back of my closet. It wasn't revenge I was after. It was insurance. Now, as I sat at my kitchen table staring at the envelope that represented my silence, I realized just how much they'd underestimated me. They thought the cancer had broken my body, that grief had hollowed my resolve, and that age had dulled my instincts. What they didn't know was that cancer had stripped away my fear, grief had sharpened my focus, and age had taught me how to wait and how to document everything. I stood up, walked to my bedroom closet, and pulled out the lockbox. It was heavier than I remembered. Inside were 4 years of memos, emails, printouts, and handwritten notes, some with annotations, others with names, dates, and discrepancies highlighted in red. I flipped through a file containing evidence of falsified loan applications. Another showed backdated safety reports. One email thread revealed direct instructions from Travis to approve certifications that hadn't yet been reviewed. I didn't know exactly what my next move was, but I knew who to call. Gregory Lane had been Wilburn's chief financial officer for over a decade before leaving to join the Securities Compliance Bureau in D.C. A man of integrity in a sea of corporate sharks, he'd once told me. "If something doesn't smell right, Caroline, don't just open a window, write it down." We hadn't spoken in years, but I still had his number, and that night, I sat on the edge of my bed and dialed. He picked up on the second ring. Gregory listened silently for nearly 2 hours that evening, only interjecting to clarify a timeline or ask for names I had long since committed to memory. His voice, once calm and methodical, grew firmer as the conversation unfolded, and by the end of the call, he didn't offer platitudes or ask if I was sure. I think he knew I'd crossed that threshold long before I picked up the phone. "Caroline," he said, his tone steady, "you need to secure those documents and bring them in Monday. Don't sign anything and don't answer any more of their calls." The moment I hung up, a different kind of silence settled over the house. It wasn't the peaceful hush of evening or the quiet that follows a long day. It was the kind of silence that makes the walls feel too close and every sound too loud. I stared at the box of files sitting next to me, now both a shield and a burden. And I realized this wasn't just a fight to reclaim a pensionate, it was a fight to reclaim my worth. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts spun between scenes from board meetings and spreadsheets, policy manuals, and past conversations I could now see in a new, sinister light. I replayed the moment I was handed that severance envelope over and over, as if inspecting it might change its meaning. But what haunted me more than Travis's words or the cowardice of those around him was the unmistakable truth that no a single person had stood up for me. After 3 decades of loyalty, mentorship, and sacrifice, I was escorted out like a problem to be erased, not a person to be thanked. On Saturday morning, I began to work. I sorted the documents by type and date, cross-referenced key events, and created an index that any investigator could follow. I didn't stop for breakfast, and only remembered lunch when the light from the window had shifted noticeably. It was mechanical at first, almost numbing, but soon I felt something begin to flicker beneath the surface. Not hope, not yet, but a sense of direction. As I fed reports through the scanner and placed each copy into carefully labeled envelopes, I reminded myself that I hadn't made it this far by accident. I had survived chemotherapy, widowhood, and now betrayal, not because I was lucky, but because I was thorough and I didn't give up. Still, as the hours wore on and the sun dipped low behind the trees outside, the enormity of what I was doing began to press down harder. I was alone. The company had power, lawyers, and resources. I had a lockbox and a name that barely meant anything anymore. The phone rang first, Janet from HR, then Travis, then a voice I didn't recognize who identified himself as legal counsel for Wilburn Dynamics. Each message carried a rising urgency. We need the signed paperwork today. We can send a courier. Failure to comply may affect your eligibility for severance. Their desperation was cloaked in politeness, but I could hear it. Clear panic was seeping through the cracks. I didn't answer. Instead, I finished labeling the last of the 3 envelopes sewn for Gregory and the Securities Compliance Bureau, one for my own records and one to keep on hand, just in case. By then, it was nearly dark, and I had just settled into the quiet hum of my living room when the doorbell rang. I froze. Through the peephole, I saw him, Travis Denton. His immaculate suit looked out of place against the peeling paint of my porch, and he held an envelope in one hand like it was a peace offering, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Caroline," he called out, voice low but insistent. "This is unnecessary. Let's be adults about this. Just sign the papers and we can all move on." I didn't reply. I stood behind the door, listening as he shifted on his feet, muttered something under his breath, and eventually slipped the envelope into my mailbox before walking briskly back to his car and speeding off. Inside, I sat down on the couch, the pressure in my chest heavier than any illness I had known. I felt like the air itself had changed denser, harder to breathe. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but the truth was, I didn't have anyone who would truly understand. My daughter, Elizabeth, living in San Diego with 2 kids and a career of her own, called every Sunday, and I had been careful to keep this from her. But as the phone buzzed with her name that evening, I realized I couldn't lie anymore. "Mom, you sound different," she said, almost immediately. "What's going on?" I hesitated. The words caught in my throat not because I was afraid, but because saying it aloud would make it real. "I was let go yesterday," I said, calmly. 3 days before my retirement benefits were set to lock in. They knew exactly what they were doing. There was a beat of stunned silence, and then her voice cracked with disbelief. "They can't do that. That has to be illegal. Do you want me to come out there? I'll book a flight tonight." I smiled, not because I was okay, but because I needed her to believe I would be. "No, sweetheart, I've got this covered." And I did. Not in the way she meant with lawyers and press releases, but in the way that mattered more. I had the truth, the records, the receipts. I had the discipline of a woman who had spent her life putting puzzle pieces together and knew when the picture was being manipulated. Still, that night, as the shadows stretched across the ceiling and the house creaked with the weight of the quiet, I felt something deeper than anger, something colder than fear. It was the bitter edge of abandonment, the cruel sting of being discarded not because you failed, but because you endured too long to be convenient. They thought they were silencing me. What they didn't know was that they had set something in motion. And by Monday morning, I wouldn't be the one answering questions. By Sunday morning, something in me had shifted, not in the loud, defiant way people imagine when they talk about standing up, but in a quieter, more resolute manner that settles deep in your bones. I had spent the last 48 hours cycling through a storm of doubt, grief, and something dangerously close to helplessness. But what remained, once that storm passed, was a stillness of clarity that I hadn't felt in years. I woke early, made coffee the way I always did, and sat at the kitchen table surrounded by neatly stacked folders and envelopes, each containing fragments of a story the company had hoped would remain buried. I reviewed every document one final time, not because I didn't trust my work, but because attention to detail had always been my armor, the one constant in a world that often made no sense. Gregory had warned me that once I handed over this evidence, There would be no turning back that whistleblower protections were real, yes, but so were the risks. Yet the thought of backing down, of signing that severance agreement, and vanishing into silence felt like a deeper kind of death than anything the cancer had ever threatened. So I pressed on. I dressed with care that day, not out of vanity, but with purpose. The navy blue blazer I chose had once been my go-to for compliance audits, a kind of uniform for days when I needed to be taken seriously. As I stood in front of the mirror, I didn't see a woman broken by illness or cast aside by a younger, shinier leadership team. I saw someone who had held the line for decades, who had said no when others said yes too easily, and who had refused to trade integrity for convenience. With the documents secured in a fireproof briefcase and 2 backup sets hidden safely away, I left the house without telling anyone where I was going. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed this step, this first act of resistance to belong only to me. The federal building in downtown Columbus stood quiet in the morning light, all glass and concrete, as if nothing of consequence could ever happen behind its calm facade. But I knew better. Inside, Gregory met me in the lobby with that same measured calm that had always made him seem 10 years older than he was. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a look that held no pity, only respect. "I wish it hadn't come to this," he said. "I wish a lot of things," I replied. He led me to a conference room where 2 other officials from the Securities Compliance Bureau were waiting, one, a senior enforcement officer named Angela Monroe, the other, a forensic analyst, Daniel Ruiz, whose quiet nod and thick folder of materials told me he had already begun his work. The mood was professional, but I could sense the weight in the air, the awareness that this wasn't just paperwork. This was the beginning of something larger. Angela began the meeting by confirming that once I provided my statement and submitted the documentation, a formal investigation would be launched. Everything I said, everything I turned over, would carry legal weight. I didn't flinch. I had lived my life preparing for audits and legal reviews. I knew the language, I understood the stakes, so I spoke clearly and with precision, guiding them through the years of manipulated records, altered certifications, and quiet orders passed down through unofficial channels, all while the board turned its head the other way. Daniel examined each report with growing concern, occasionally pausing to scribble notes or whisper to Angela, who nodded grimly. When I laid out the timeline of how Travis had systematically redirected my reports into silence, how they had shifted responsibility without accountability, and how my termination coincided almost to the hour with the final vesting of my pension, no one in the room questioned the motive. They didn't have to. 3 hours passed before we reached the final document. I watched Angela slide it into the folder, close it carefully, and then sit back with a deep breath that sounded heavier than it should have. "This isn't just a case of wrongful termination," she said. "What you've described and what you've documented suggests a much broader issue of securities fraud. And from what we can see, it didn't start with Travis." I had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud left a bitter taste. There had always been warning signs, subtle shifts in language during quarterly reviews, unexplained discrepancies in expense forecasts, but I had hoped, perhaps naively, that the rot was recent. Now, it seemed, the decay ran deeper, and I was about to be the match that lit it all on fire. They thanked me, not with hollow words, but with the kind of acknowledgement that only professionals who've seen too many people stay silent can give. As I left the building, the wind caught my coat, and I looked up at the cloudy sky, wondering whether the storm was finally behind me or if it was just beginning. Back at home, my phone had already begun to ring, again calls from the HR office, from Travis, from a number I didn't recognize that I assumed belonged to Wilburn's legal team. Each one left a message more frantic than the last, the tone shifting from polite insistence to veiled threat. "You're risking everything," one message warned. "This won't end the way you think." But they were wrong. I wasn't risking everything. I had already lost everything that mattered in that building. My sense of place, of loyalty, of dignity, and what remained wasn't for them to take. I had nothing left to protect except the truth. And the truth, as I had learned through loss and illness and quiet betrayal, was the only thing that ever endured. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the rooftops, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry either. I felt ready, because some people crumble when they're cornered, and others sharpen. By Monday morning, the weight I carried had not lifted, but it had transformed. What once felt like a burden now felt like a charge on. I could no longer afford to carry quietly. I arrived early at the federal building, the streets of downtown Columbus still slick with the remnants of dawn rain, and stepped into the calm, clinical lobby with my briefcase in hand, guarded not by fear, but by certainty. Gregory met me just inside the elevators, his face more tense than it had been the day before. He didn't waste time with greetings. Instead, he led me to a secure conference room on the 6th floor where the investigation team had already assembled. Angela Monroe, the senior enforcement attorney, nodded solemnly, while Daniel Ruiz, the forensic analyst, flipped open a fresh notepad with quiet efficiency. They weren't just here to listen anymore. They were here to act. I spent the next 3 hours walking them through every detail: dates, discrepancies, flag transactions, the company's evasive responses to my reports, and most damning of all, the sudden redirection of compliance oversight after Travis's arrival. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. Misrepresented earnings, manipulated certifications, and a paper trail that, once pieced together, outlined a deliberate and systematic scheme to inflate Wilburn Dynamics' valuation while burying regulatory risk. Angela's expression grew tighter with every folder I opened, every email I annotated, every pattern I made visible. By the time we reached the final document internal memo that directly contradicted Wilburn's most recent public earnings call, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly, as though absorbing the weight of a truth too long ignored. "This," she said, "goes far beyond internal misconduct. We're talking about potential securities fraud, false statements to investors, and obstruction of compliance protocol." Gregory nodded, adding that the next step would be immediate engagement with Wilburn's legal team to demand cooperation, secure remaining documents, and begin a formal inquiry. He cautioned that things would likely escalate quickly, that once the company caught wind of the investigation, they would either scramble to conceal what they could or attempt to undermine the source of the complaint. And that source was me. I returned home to find 6 missed calls and 2 voicemails, each more desperate than the last. One was from Janet, her voice uneasy, hinting at some buzz in the executive suite, while the second came directly from Travis. He didn't sound angry this time, he sounded nervous. "Caroline, we need to talk. Let's be reasonable. There's still a path forward that benefits everyone." But his attempt at civility arrived too late. That afternoon, I received a call not from an attorney, but from the chair of Wilburn's board, Howard Mercer, a man I had met only twice in 30 years and who had barely looked up from his phone during both occasions. His tone was different from Travis's. It carried an edge of practiced diplomacy wrapped in concern. "Ms. Hayes, I'd like to extend a formal invitation to discuss your recent termination. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." I told him I was unavailable for any in-house meetings and that, moving forward, all communication should go through my counseling through the Securities Compliance Bureau. The pause that followed was long and heavy, broken only by a terse acknowledgement before the line went dead. By Tuesday morning, word had spread. Janet called again, not with sympathy this time, but with something close to fear. "They called an emergency meeting. People are panicking. Legal is running around like something's exploded." It had. By noon, Wilburn Dynamics' general counsel received formal notice from the Bureau, prompting a flurry of internal chaos. Executives were pulled into closed-door sessions, phones were confiscated, and the once confident stride of senior leadership had been replaced with whispers and hurried glances. I wasn't in the building, but I didn't need to be. Gregory kept me informed as investigators began requesting key files, and the board hastily ordered a comprehensive review of past financial disclosures language that, in corporate speak, might as well have been a confession. That evening, I received another call from Howard this time, more measured, more deliberate. "Caroline," he began, "the board recognizes that your dismissal may have been premature. We'd like to extend full reinstatement, with retroactive benefits and immediate restoration of your pension eligibility. We also believe you could serve a valuable consulting role during this transition." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for an apology. I simply stated that any future discussions would involve legal representation and federal oversight. "Let me be clear, Mr. Mercer," I said. "I didn't come forward because I wanted my job back. I came forward because what happened wasn't just wrong, it was unlawful. I was removed not because of my performance, but because I refused to sign off on something I knew violated federal law. I was targeted because I knew too much and asked too many questions. There was a long silence. "I see," he said quietly. "Then I suppose we'll be hearing from the Bureau." "You already have," I replied. That night, news broke. A regional business journal leaked that Wilburn Dynamics was under federal investigation for potential financial irregularities. And within hours, the company's stock took a hit. Analysts speculated, employees whispered, and Travis, according to Janet Thaddeus, been seen in the building all day. For the first time in days, I slept soundly. Not because I felt victorious, but because I finally felt seen. This wasn't over. The storm had only just begun. But for the first time, it wasn't swirling quietly inside me. It was out in the open now, where it belonged, where facts would be weighed and decisions would have consequences. They had tried to silence me. Instead, they amplified the sound of everything they tried to hide. By Wednesday morning, the storm had taken a form I hadn't dared to envision. Not just a whisper campaign or corporate scrambling behind closed doors, but a full-blown reckoning that has spilled beyond the sterile walls of Wilburn Dynamics and into public light. Headlines on regional business outlets declared an active federal investigation, while television anchors read statements from regulatory agencies confirming their involvement. The company's stock dropped over 17% in a single afternoon, and as news continued to spread, so did the ripple of panic behind boardroom doors. I wasn't in the office to witness it, but colleagues began reaching out cautiously at first, through text messages and private emails, expressing shock, confusion, and in some cases, quiet solidarity. They had seen the SEC investigators arrive. They had heard about the subpoenas, the files being seized, the senior leadership avoiding eye contact as they were summoned one by one into urgent meetings. Some apologized for their silence. Others simply said, "Thank you," as if I had done what they had long hoped someone would. That evening, as I was finishing a cup of tea in the same quiet kitchen where I had once stared down that severance agreement, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a plea or a warning. It was Janet from HR, her voice trembling as she explained that the board had held an emergency session earlier that afternoon. Travis had been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. "Things are unraveling, Caroline," she said, barely above a whisper. "The executive committee has frozen all terminations and is reviewing your case. They're scared." She didn't need to say it out loud. I already knew. The following day, I received a certified letter from Wilburn's legal department officially rescinding my termination. They had, as expected, placed me on administrative leave with full benefits, retroactive to the date of dismissal, pending the results of a formal internal audit. It was a paper shield against public fallout, a gesture dressed in legal language meant to protect them, not mebut. Even so, it was something. It was acknowledgement, however reluctant, that they could no longer ignore what they had done. The next morning, I returned to the place that had once discarded me without hesitation. The same security guard who had silently watched me carry my belongings out of the building now held the door open with a faint nod of respect. His posture had changed. So had mine. I was escorted to a glass-walled boardroom on the top floor when I had entered, only twice in my career, and never as a peer. Inside, I found a room filled not with defiance, but with carefully composed unease. Howard Mercer sat at the head of the table, flanked by the company's external counsel and 3 other board members, all of whom avoided direct eye contact until it became clear that I wasn't there alone. Beside me sat Barbara Keenemy, attorney, and one of the few people who had treated my case not as a procedural mess, but as a moral one. She opened the meeting not with aggression, but with clarity, establishing that we were there not to negotiate reinstatement, but to demand transparency and address years of deliberate negligence. Howard began with rehearsed contrition. He spoke of the company's deep regret over how my concerns had been mishandled and how my dismissal had not reflected the values Wilburn Dynamics strives to uphold. He mentioned the possibility of a consulting role, of legacy building, of redemption wrapped in brand preservation. I listened, silent, until he paused, waiting for my reaction. I looked at him steadily and spoke only when the air felt still enough to carry the full weight of what needed to be said. Over 29 years, I submitted 47 formal reports documenting compliance issues. I sent 17 memoranda specifically flagging the kinds of violations now under investigation. I requested 10 meetings with senior leadership and only 2 were granted, both of which ended with polite dismissal. When I refused to approve falsified documentation, I was removed 3 days before my pension vested. This isn't about regrets, Mr. Mercer. It's about accountability. I did my job. Now it's time for you to do yours. Barbara let the silence linger just long enough before adding that any potential cooperation from my side would be coordinated through the SEC and under strict legal advisement. The meeting ended not with a handshake, but with a deep, unmistakable shift in power, one they hadn't expected, and I had never demanded, but had earned through something far more enduring than status. By the end of the week, the public narrative had changed. Where I had once been described in corporate whispers as a bitter former employee, I was now being referenced in headlines as a whistleblower, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes reverently. A woman who had, despite health battles and institutional betrayal, stood her ground. The same business analysts who had once praised Travis's cost efficiencies were now questioning the very legitimacy of the data they had used to build their confidence. It should have felt like vindication. And in some ways, it did. But more than anything, it felt like sorrow, not for what had happened to me, but for the realization that it had taken so long for anyone to listen, that I had shouted into a void for years, only to be heard when the consequences could no longer be ignored. The weeks that followed were a blur of interviews, statements, and legal briefings. Travis resigned under pressure, citing health reasons no one believed. 3 board members quietly stepped down before the next quarterly filing. The company announced sweeping reforms to its compliance policies, hiring outside consultants to design protocols I had spent years recommending from the inside. They even asked if I'd consider returning to help oversee the process. I declined. Instead, I began working with regulatory groups, helping draft stronger whistleblower protections and building out ethics programs designed to catch violations before they demanded headlines. My pension was restored. My benefits were secured, but the most unexpected outcome came one quiet afternoon when I received a handwritten letter not from the company, but from a young compliance officer in another state who had read my story and written, "You made me feel less alone." In that moment, I understood something deeper than justice or revenge. What I had done, quietly, methodically, and at great personal cost, had made a crack in something much larger than me. And through that crack, light had begun to shine. 6 months after I was escorted out of Wilburn Dynamics with a cardboard box and a silence no one dared break, I stood inside a quiet federal courtroom and watched Travis Denton enter through the side door, flanked by attorneys who no longer walked with confidence but with the weighted pace of damage control. The once slick suit hung slightly looser on his frame, and the polished arrogance that had defined him seemed to have dulled into something much closer to fear. He didn't look at Minot directly, but when our eyes briefly met, I saw the flicker of recognition. Not of me, necessarily, but of what I had come to represent, the consequence of underestimating a woman with nothing left to lose. Beside him stood 2 former board members, men who had signed off on the very documents I had spent years questioning, men who had nodded politely in meetings while quietly helping bury the truth. One by one, they entered guilty pleas for securities fraud, falsified statements, and obstruction of compliance, a string of charges that mirrored the same concerns I had documented and raised for years, only to be dismissed as overcautious. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was something heavier, more complex. It was the weight of vindication tied to the knowledge that this outcome had come at a cost far greater than a job. It had cost me years of sleep, the erosion of professional trust, the silence of colleagues too scared to speak, and moments with my daughter I couldn't get back. And yet, there was also a calm that settled deep in my chest, a quiet, unshakable peace that I had done what was right even when no one wanted to see it. After the proceedings, I declined the press interviews and left through a side exit, accompanied only by Barbara, whose steady presence had been one of the few constants during those turbulent months. Outside, the wind carried the chill of early autumn, and as I zipped up my coat, she looked at me and said, "You changed more than one company today." I didn't respond, not right away, because I knew what she meant, and I also knew the change wasn't about punishment. It was about precedent, about proving that people like me, older, grayer, maybe a little slower to adapt, but never slower to care, still had power, still had value, and still had a voice when the world tried to write us off. In the weeks that followed, Wilburn Dynamics scrambled to rebuild its reputation. issuing apologies, restructuring leadership, and launching a new ethics division with glossy brochures and language that mimicked the very memos I had once sent in vain. They mailed me copies of their annual report, perhaps out of obligation, or perhaps out of guilt. I read them carefully, not because I wanted to gloat, but because I needed to believe that change was more than cosmetic. I never went back. Instead, I took the whistleblower award granted by the Securities Bureau, a sum that, combined with my restored pension and a quiet legal settlement, gave me more financial security than I had ever imagined possible, and I built something of my own. I started a foundation in my husband's name, focused on mentoring older women re-entering the workforce after illness, grief, or layoffs. I spoke at small community colleges, volunteered with consumer protection groups, and helped draft whistleblower training protocols that would become national templates. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And it mattered. Elizabeth moved back to Ohio with her children not long after. And on weekends, we'd sit on the back porch of my new lakeside home, watching the sun dip below the horizon while the grandkids ran along the dock. Sometimes she'd ask about Wilburn, about what I would have done differently if given the chance, and I'd always answer the same way, quietly, truthfully. I don't regret working there, I told her one evening, as golden light danced across the water. I regret that they made me fight for what I already earned. But I don't regret standing up, because integrity doesn't mean doing what's right when it's easy. It means doing it when it costs you. She nodded, not like a child agreeing with her mother, but like a woman who understood something bone deep. And in that moment, surrounded by family, time, and space I had once sacrificed in the name of duty, I realized the story wasn't really about revenge at all. It was about recognition of truth, of worth, of the quiet strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. It was about showing those who've been discarded that they were never disposable. And above all, it was about proving that it is never too late to reclaim your story.